Some people lose their temper over the smallest things: a delayed text reply, a small, harmless mistake, a comment that really didn't mean much, a tangled charging cable, a dropped spoon on the kitchen floor. And from the outside, it looks like a massive overreaction, like they're being dramatic, like they're immature, like they are completely out of control. But what if that reaction isn't random? What if anger is actually one of the most predictable, logical, emotional responses your brain can produce? You've seen this happen before. Maybe you've felt it happen inside yourself. Someone snaps suddenly. Their voice gets louder. Their posture stiffens. The entire energy in the room shifts in a matter of seconds. And then later, they calm down. The heat fades. The room goes quiet. And the shame arrives. Sometimes they regret it instantly. Sometimes they apologize profusely. Sometimes they don't even understand why it happened in the first place. They just feel the crushing, familiar weight of having overreacted again. So the obvious explanation becomes the easiest one to believe. They just have a bad temper. They have a terribly short fuse. But that explanation is far too simple. And more importantly, it's completely wrong. Because anger is almost never the first emotion. It's the second. Which means something else came before it. Something much faster. Something much quieter. Something incredibly easy to miss. Underneath anger, there is almost always another emotion trying to be processed. It could be disrespect. It could be deep embarrassment. It could be the sting of rejection. It could be the sudden, terrifying feeling of losing control over your environment. It could be profound, invisible exhaustion. But these baseline emotions all have one thing in common. They feel highly vulnerable. And the human brain is not designed to stay in a state of vulnerability for very long. So it does something absolutely brilliant. It converts that vulnerable feeling into something stronger, something more powerful, something that feels like heavy armor: anger. Psychologists call this a bodyguard emotion. Anger doesn't walk into the room alone. It kicks the door down to protect the softer, fragile emotion hiding right behind it. Because anger is not just a feeling, it's an active, defensive response. It's your nervous system screaming, "Something is threatening us, and we need to fight back." And to understand why this happens so quickly, you have to look at how your brain is actually wired. Deep inside your brain, there is a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons. It is called the amygdala. It is your brain's ultimate threat detection center. Its entire job is to constantly scan your environment for danger, not just physical threats like a falling branch or a speeding car, but emotional threats too. It scans for anything that could hurt you, embarrass you, or make you feel fundamentally unsafe. And when the amygdala detects a threat, it doesn't wait for your permission to act. It reacts instantly. When a threat is perceived, the amygdala essentially hijacks the brain. It temporarily cuts the connection to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the rational, adult part of your brain, the part that understands logic, the part that understands consequences, the part that knows dropping a spoon is not a life or death emergency. But the amygdala shuts that logic down entirely. It floods your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. It doesn't react accurately. It reacts immediately. This is exactly why your anger often feels like it appears out of nowhere. Because by the time your conscious mind becomes aware of the anger, your brain has already decided that you are under attack. And it has already started preparing your physical body for a war. Your heart rate increases. Your muscles tighten. Your attention narrows to a single sharp point. Everything in your system shifts violently toward action, because from your amygdala's perspective, hesitation equals risk. Now here's where the science gets even more interesting, and where it completely changes how you should view your own temper. People who lose their temper easily are not always less in control. In many clinical cases, they are simply more sensitive. They are hypervigilant. They notice things much faster than anyone else in the room. A slight shift in someone's tone of voice, a micro-expression passing over a face, small, subtle changes in behavior that signal a mood shift. Things most people would completely ignore or process very slowly. Their brain picks up almost immediately. But instead of just sitting with that new information, their brain reacts to it. Quickly, directly, and sometimes aggressively. Living with a nervous system this fast is incredibly exhausting because you are never truly at rest. Your brain is constantly calculating the emotional temperature of the room, constantly predicting what might go wrong so you can brace for impact. By the time a minor inconvenience actually happens, you are already mentally drained. So what looks like an insane overreaction from the outside is actually fast detection combined with deep fatigue and fast defense. Your nervous system is not broken, it's just faster. It is highly optimized to keep you safe, but speed has a massive cost. Because when reactions are that fast, they are also entirely unfiltered. They are less processed, they are less understood, and that is why the anger can feel completely disproportionate to the actual situation, because your brain is not just reacting to what happened in this exact moment. It is reacting to what this moment represents. It is reacting to the pattern. And this is where your past enters the room. At some point in your life, your brain learned a very specific lesson about how to handle emotional situations. Usually, this happens in childhood. Think back to how you grew up. Maybe you lived in a house where you weren't heard unless you raised your voice. Maybe calm, polite communication literally did not work. Maybe expressing softer emotions like sadness, fear, or confusion wasn't safe. If you cried, you were told you were being too sensitive. If you asked for help, you were ignored. So your brain adapted to survive. It found a response that actually worked, a response that forced people to finally pay attention, a response that created a firm boundary, a response that gave you a tiny bit of control in a wildly uncontrollable environment. Anger became the ultimate illusion of control. It made you feel large when you actually felt very small. It made you feel powerful when you actually felt entirely helpless. And your brain held onto it. Because from a strict biological survival perspective, if a tool keeps you safe, you never throw it away. Even if the situation changes decades later, even when you are an adult sitting in a perfectly safe living room. So now, in the present, your brain still reaches for the exact same tool, even when it's no longer necessary, even when it terrifies the people you love, even when it creates massive problems in your daily life. This is why people who lose their temper easily often feel so deeply misunderstood, because from the outside, people only see the reaction. They only see the explosion. They don't see what triggered it. They don't see the massive chain of events happening internally in a fraction of a second. They don't see the initial fragile emotion that started everything. They don't see the heavy metal shield your brain threw up to protect you. They just see the sharp spikes on the outside of the shield, and they judge you for it. But inside your body, the experience is entirely different. Inside, it feels like a line was crossed, like something incredibly important was threatened, like your safety was compromised, and the angry response feels completely justified, at least in that specific heated moment. But here's the part that most people don't talk about, the part that keeps you trapped in the exact same cycle. Anger is a very powerful shield, but it's also highly imprecise. It solves the immediate discomfort. It creates a temporary sense of control. It aggressively pushes the perceived threat away, but it almost never solves the actual underlying problem, because the real issue was never the anger itself. It was the vulnerable emotion hiding directly underneath the shield. And when that vulnerable emotion doesn't get addressed, it doesn't just disappear. It stays. It builds, it waits quietly in the dark, and it shows up again in the next situation, and the next, and the next, which is exactly why the pattern repeats itself endlessly. Not because you want it to, not because you enjoy feeling out of control, but because the core system hasn't changed. You keep fighting the bodyguard instead of talking to the person it's protecting. And this is exactly where awareness becomes your most important tool, not to completely eliminate anger. Because anger itself is not the enemy. Anger is simply information. It is a biological signal. It tells you that something deeply matters to you. It tells you that a boundary needs your attention. But if you only focus on the loud signal and ignore the quiet source, nothing will ever truly change. So the real question you need to ask yourself is not, why do I get angry so easily? That question just leads to more shame and self-hatred. The much better, much more psychological question is, what was I feeling right before the anger arrived? Because in that tiny, microscopic window of time, just before the reaction fully takes over, there is always something else, something much quieter, something much more honest. Maybe it was the sudden fear of being abandoned. Maybe it was the sting of feeling completely invisible again. Maybe it was the crushing weight of knowing you have to do everything yourself. If you can learn to notice that quiet feeling, even for a single second, everything starts to shift. Because that's the exact point where you move from reacting to understanding, from automatic, deeply ingrained behavior to conscious, adult awareness. And that doesn't mean you will never feel anger again. It just means that anger won't be the only thing you feel. You will start to see the complex layers beneath it. You will start to recognize your own survival patterns. You will start to understand your own nervous system in a way that simply wasn't possible before. And over time, that deep understanding creates something incredible. It creates space. Space between the trigger and the reaction. Space where you actually have a choice. Maybe you won't catch it every single time. Maybe you won't catch it immediately. But you will catch it enough to make a profound difference. Because real emotional control is not about suppressing your feelings or pretending you aren't mad. It's about finally understanding them. And once you understand what your anger is actually trying to protect, it stops feeling like an enemy you constantly have to fight. It starts feeling like a guide you can learn from. So the next time you feel your temper rising, when the heat floods your chest and your vision narrows, don't rush to shut it down, and don't rush to let it out. Pause for just one moment, not to stop the shield from forming, but to look directly behind it, because whatever you find hiding back there is your real story. And once you start seeing that clearly, your reactions will begin to change naturally. Not because you forced them to, not because you shamed yourself into submission, but because you finally understood what your brain was trying to tell you all along. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Think about the last time you got angry over something incredibly small, not the explosive reaction, but the tiny moment just before it. If you are completely honest with yourself, what was the bodyguard actually protecting? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.